Things are not looking good for this toxic, corrupt system right now. All over the world, young people are protesting, revolting, demanding, and in many cases, actually achieving real change. And that's because you guys are just becoming way too dangerously smart for a system that relied on you being dumb, mindless sheep the way past generations were for centuries. You're asking all the right questions, and in this video, we got all the right answers for you. You see, this corrupt, exploitative system was all built on one sick, manipulative lie. Once we expose it, however, which we're soon about to do, you'll totally overcome this disrespectful society that once tried to break you. Let's get this show on the road. This is a whiteout, one of the deadliest natural disasters you could find yourself in. Here's how it happens. On a very chilly and snowy afternoon, heavy winds rapidly pick up out of nowhere, kicking the powdery snow up into the air. The snow on the ground blends in with the falling snow from the sky, and before you know it, all you see is white. Everywhere around you. You have no depth perception, no visual cues, no ability to even tell up from down or left from right. The average person caught in a whiteout will die of exposure within a matter of hours, and even the most skilled survival experts have trouble navigating this environment. But for a 70-year-old elderly Inuit tribesman, however, this is just another day at the office, a walk in the park, literally. He calmly and nonchalantly strolls through the whiteout back to the Inuit village with absolutely no issue whatsoever. Literally, just like you or I would walk to the store. How the hell is he able to do this? And more importantly, how does this relate to you and the horrible mental health crisis afflicting Gen Z today? Well, we're about to find out. The Inuit tribes are some of the strongest, most resilient people in all of human history. For over 5,000 years, they've lived and thrived in one of the harshest environments on Earth, the Arctic tundra. They've survived polar bears, year-round negative 60-degree weather, polar nights, a phenomenon where you have 4 consecutive months of darkness without any sunlight every single winter. And of course, deadly whiteouts that would kill the most skilled survivalists within a matter of hours. And yet, despite these incredibly harsh natural conditions, they're remarkably one of the happiest and healthiest people on record. Depression, anxiety, suicide, all these mental health crises decimating Gen Z today were extraordinarily rare in Inuit tribes. Well, until about 1930, unfortunately, when something really bad happened that we'll talk about soon. Wage slavery. Inuit tribes had remarkably good mental health despite the incredibly harsh environmental conditions they lived in. Jean Briggs was a famous anthropologist in the 1960s who spent a year and a half living with an Inuit family in the Canadian Arctic. Her observations of daily Inuit life were shocking to say the least. They only worked 1 or 2 days per week to catch seals for food and spent the rest of their time playing games, telling stories, singing, and dancing. They had much more time for leisure than any of us could ever dream of. Most notably, however, she said that she never saw an Inuit adult get angry, not even one single time. So, I've made a lot of videos about hunter-gatherers before and how they had objectively far superior quality of life metrics compared to the average Gen Z today, constantly being beaten down and worn out by their exploitation wage slave jobs. Now, the common response I always get is, so, if you like it so much, why don't you just move there? You wouldn't survive 2 weeks in an igloo. Now, the problem with this response, however, is that you can throw their very own logic right back at them in the exact same manner. There are a few hunter-gatherer tribes still remaining today, and none of them want to join modern society either. If modern society and this wage slave system we live under is so much better, why do none of them voluntarily join us? There have been many attempts from governments around the world to kick them off their land and force them to join modern society. If the 9-to-5 wage slave system was so great, they would eagerly and happily join. And yet, the exact opposite happens every single time. They passionately fight for their land and vehemently refuse. Despite their efforts to retain the God-given land they lived on for centuries, some of them are still sadly forced out, displaced, and coerced into these corporate 9-to-5 meat grinder jobs, just like the rest of us. The Inuit tribes are unfortunately a very sad tale of what happens next. Within one generation, this incredibly resilient tribe, who survived whiteouts, polar bears, negative 60-degree weather, and 4 consecutive months of darkness, spiraled into record levels of depression, alcohol abuse, and suicide. They survived the deadliest conditions of the Arctic for over 5,000 years, but once they were forced into the same horrible economic conditions Gen Z faces today, they even couldn't take it anymore. So to fully understand why, let's first take an epic journey through history. Part 1. The moralization of poverty. With the exception of hunter-gatherers, being poor has always sucked throughout history. There's no denying that. In fact, materially speaking, you could easily make an argument that being poor was far worse in past historical eras. Psychologically speaking, however, the last 200 to 300 years has been the absolute worst time to be poor, bar none. And this isn't even remotely debatable. This is because of a relatively recent and modern phenomenon known as the moralization of poverty. Now, what this means in basic plain English is that being poor doesn't just mean being poor anymore. Being poor means you're lazy, you're stupid, you're worthless, you're a loser. Poverty is and always has been a hell of a burden and challenge to overcome in and of itself, even without the moralization of poverty. But once you add that into the mix, poverty then goes from a manageable challenge to a nonstop, constant psychological torture chamber. Being poor in the past was simply being poor. Nothing more, nothing less. It wasn't a crime, an indictment on your character, proof that you're a horrible human being. None of that. This isn't a radical Marxist communist point of view either. This is literally how we did it for the overwhelming majority of human history. Let's start with my personal favorite era, the Roman Empire. Anyone with even basic grade school history knowledge knows that ancient Rome was far from a classless, egalitarian, communist utopia. It was heavily stratified, unequal, and hierarchical, and status-based. But here's the key difference. Status in ancient Rome wasn't based on wealth alone, and in a way it wasn't even based on wealth at all. Status was far more based on honor, dignity, and bravado. Sure, wealth definitely played a part in the equation, but it was seen more as a means to an end rather than the end itself. Case in point, most Roman landlords were constrained by social pressure, riot risk, and political consequences to provide actual affordable housing to the urban poor. Constrained is actually sugarcoating it quite a bit here, because if they ever raised rents too high, massive riots, protests, and civil unrest would follow, because people back then simply just didn't blame themselves for being poor. And the result was that the average rent back then only cost about 5 to 10 days worth of wages. Ancient Rome also had a proto-universal basic income system known as the cura annona, which we covered in depth in a previous video. Every male citizen was given a free grain subsidy funded by the state for over 600 years. Now, this is because both the elites and the people back then viewed it as the responsibility of the system to feed the very people that kept the system running. You simply just weren't looked down upon for being poor the way you are today. The hilarious thing about the cura annona, which I forgot to mention in my previous video, was that contrary to the constant shame and blame of modern-day welfare programs, being a recipient of the cura annona was actually a symbol of immense pride and honor. Ancient Romans would literally inscribe on their tombstones that they were a proud recipient of the cura annona. Hey guys, you may have noticed we're getting very close to 50,000 subscribers now. This has always been a huge milestone in our eyes, so if you're new here and enjoying this content, definitely consider subscribing and helping us get closer to this big magic number. Thanks a bunch, you guys are the best. Zakat is one of the key 5 pillars of Islam. It's the Arabic word for giving to the needy. But in Islamic Caliphate, it wasn't just a religious belief, it was literally an economic policy as well. A state-managed, obligatory religious 2.5% tax on wealth. Not on income, mind you, on wealth. Assets like savings, livestock, gold, and crops, for example. Much like the wealth tax on billionaires we're seeing Gen Z and millennials call for today. Rich Muslims had to pay into this crucial pillar of Islam for wealth redistribution, purifying wealth, and funding social welfare, with its collection and distribution managed by the ruler or appointed officials. This function evolved from the Prophet's era into state policy, playing a huge role in governance and social justice. Now, some boomers in the comments might argue that it's because we moralized poverty today that we have it so much better. Better technology, living standards, and innovation than they did. That our superior modern life is proof that demonizing poor people motivated them to go out, work hard, and advance society. Now, we kind of already proved this totally wrong with the Roman Empire. The Romans were incredibly technologically advanced for their time. They built all kinds of incredible technologies, architecture, and infrastructure, some of which still rivals modern cities 2,000 years later. They clearly were not a bunch of lazy bums sitting on their asses doing nothing all day. But our next example proves them wrong even further. Song Dynasty China is widely regarded by many historians as by far the best time to be alive in the pre-modern era. It was an absolute golden age for art, science, technology, and economic growth. Most of the working class had modest homes and even courtyards, and it was commonplace for people to just nonchalantly leave their doors unlocked, as food and resources were so abundant that there was literally no need to steal. The Song Dynasty was heavily influenced by Confucianism, which emphasized social harmony over individual blame. Famine and poverty was largely seen as the failure of the ruler and of the system, and not of the individual. Massive food granaries were built and maintained because poverty and hunger were seen as a systemic flaw and not an individual failure, once again. At this point, I'm sure a lot of boomers and corporate chills are going to be screaming communist in the comments. But the reality is that these systems existed for thousands of years, long before communism. You can cry about it being communist all you want, but then you're going to run into a massive, massive problem. These 3 past historical eras were massively prosperous and successful. If you want to make the case that they were communist, then that would throw your entire communism has never worked narrative totally out the window. Now, these 3 historical eras come from vastly different cultures, religions, time periods, and economic systems. And yet, they all seem to universally converge on one key point of agreement. The moralization of poverty is just complete bullshit. The idea of shaming the poor, kicking them while they're down, brainwashing and gaslighting them into believing it's their fault. It is not normal. It is not okay. It is never how we did it for the overwhelming majority of history. It is a pure modern phenomenon and it's total BS. It's time we put an end to it. And I really have faith that Gen Z will be the generation to ultimately do it. And now it's time to go back to our elderly Inuit tribesman. Part 3. How did he get back? So let's go back to the question of how. How does a 70-year-old elderly Inuit tribesman calmly and nonchalantly stroll back to the village in the face of a blinding, deadly whiteout that would kill even the most skilled survivalists in a matter of hours? The answer is some insane, real-life, legit, mind-blowing Jedi mind tricks. So, when the wind picks up in the Arctic, it leaves directional ridges in the snow that all point one way or another. The elderly Inuit tribesman, having been in this environment for so long, is able to feel these ridges on his feet based on sensation alone and reorient himself to the sense of direction. He calibrates where he was and where he needs to go based on these snow ridges alone, and just like that, he's able to casually stroll back to the village as if nothing had happened. This is just a small tip of the iceberg, no pun intended by the way, of just how insanely strong, resilient, and badass the Inuits are. For thousands of years, they learned to battle and fight off polar bears. They survived the deadliest natural disasters like whiteouts with ease. They survived and thrived in temperatures so cold, your breath literally freezes in the air. Clearly, they're not a bunch of lazy, soft, and entitled snowflakes. Once again, no pun intended. So this begs the question, what happens when we subject one of the most badass tribes in history to the same moralization of poverty that's destroying Gen Z's mental health today? The nonstop, endless bullshit pressure to get a job, to work your ass off, to sacrifice your entire life and well-being just to be exploited as a wage slave for corporate profits. Well, we don't have to speculate on this because unfortunately, this did actually happen to them. And it's a very sad story. Part 4, the consequences of the moralization of poverty. In the 1930s, the Canadian government began forcibly relocating the Inuit tribes into modern cities and settlements completely against their will and without their consent. They separated families, coerced them into cities and settlements. They went as far as mass slaughtering hundreds of Inuit sled dogs to permanently cut them off from their ability to travel, hunt, and fish, and live the way they used to. And of course, this was all done under the guise of progress and modernity. The Inuits were a cooperative, egalitarian hunter-gatherer society before all this happened. They were measurably happy, healthy, and free. Life, of course, was not always easy, but they had meaning, purpose, and community. They set their own schedules, worked when they wanted, and had plenty of time for leisure and hobbies. Within one generation, they were forced into the same wage slave corporate meat grinder hellscape that us Gen Z and Millennials are forced to live under. The effects on the Inuit were instant, immediate, and horrible. Being forced into modern wage slavery with bosses constantly looking over their shoulders, soulless repetitive spreadsheets, robotic clock-in clock-out schedules, they were absolutely devastated under this new economic system the exact same way we are. Over the course of the next few decades, researchers broadly and consistently found that Inuit populations across Canada, Greenland, and Alaska experienced massive surges in depression, burnout, anxiety, and hopelessness. Almost word for word, exactly like the mental health crisis Gen Z faces today. Suicide and alcohol abuse rates skyrocketed, especially amongst young men. Does this sound familiar? Now I want to be very clear about one thing. The message here is not that the Inuits couldn't adapt to the modern wage slave system because they were lazy and primitive. Clearly, they were not. Again, they survived the most brutal and dangerous natural conditions that would kill any modern person within any matter of hours. The point here is that the exploitative wage slave system and the moralization of poverty itself is so broken, corrupt, and rotten to the core that both the most badass survivors of the Arctic and modern Gen Z and Millennials alike both absolutely hate it, can't stand it, and want nothing to do with it, and are being forced into it against our will with devastating effects on our mental health and well-being. The final straw that broke the backs of the Inuit wasn't blinding whiteouts, deadly polar bears, brutal negative 60-degree weather, or 4 consecutive months of darkness. It was the moralization of poverty. This idea that your entire worth as a human being is based on your wage. The idea that your life is worthless if you're not being exploited for corporate profits. That you're somehow lazy, unskilled, or unworthy if you don't make a lot of money. This is a uniquely modern and delusional boomer worldview. Every other culture and civilization in the history of the world would say it's total, absolute bullshit, and we just proved it here. And once you realize this, you can give yourself permission to reject it, and you'll feel a whole lot better about yourself instantly after you do so.